Mysteries, chilling stories, and outcomes that seem straight out of a nightmare. Some places in the world seem destined to hold the darkest chapters in human history. And among them, there is a small island in Italy that defies even the most skeptical, where its soil is 50% made up of human ashes. Small in size but immense in secrets, it has witnessed centuries of suffering. Relentless diseases, cries of despair, and souls that, it is said, never managed to leave. This isolated piece of land became the scene of horrors that marked generations and still haunt the imagination today. Today on Bello Mundo, we're going to explore one of the most terrifying places on the planet, the mysterious and sinister island of Poveglia. Are you ready to uncover the secrets of this cursed island? Then come with us, if you dare. During the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, Italy attracted worldwide attention as one of the worst-hit countries. But long before that, the country had already faced even more terrible disease-related tragedies. Among them, the bubonic plague, the dreaded Black Plague, left a deep mark on history. At the height of this devastating epidemic, the European continent was plunged into a scene of horror. Entire villages tried to isolate themselves in the hope of escaping death. While some were able to stop the spread of the disease, others became open-air cemeteries. It is in this context that an even darker story emerges, that of the island of Poveglia. Located in Venice's peaceful lagoon, it became the final destination for thousands of people during plague outbreaks. A place where death reigned supreme, leaving an aura so heavy that even the passage of time seems to avoid that soil. But where exactly is this island? And what dark secrets does it hold? That's what Bello Mundo is going to show you now. Number 1. Location and geographical data. Poveglia, a small island of around 7.5 hectares, lies to the south of Venice. But don't let the name fool you. Although it's called that, it's not a single island, but a small archipelago divided into 3 parts. The largest of them, which has housed most of the buildings over the centuries, is connected by a bridge to a smaller island just behind it. The third part is an artificial islet, the famous octagon, built in the 1800s to protect the region, and with such a different shape that it got its name. And there's another detail. On old maps, this piece of land was called Poveglia, or Poveglia. Why? There are 2 possibilities. It could be a reference to the poplars, very common trees at the time, or perhaps to the Via Popiliana Annia, an ancient Roman road built by order of the consul Publius Popilio Lenate. Which of these explanations is right? Nobody knows for sure, but both help us understand a little more about the place's relationship with its past. Number 2. History. In the beginning, it was a quiet place, inhabited by fishermen and farmers who lived a simple life on the shores of the Venetian lagoon. But this peaceful setting began to change in the 5th century, when the region found itself in the midst of the chaos that marked the collapse of the Roman Empire. With barbarian invasions ravaging the continent, many fled there in search of protection. Among the invaders were the dreaded Huns, known for their brutality, and other Germanic tribes who left a trail of destruction wherever they went. At the time, Venice was still just a collection of islands in formation, far from being the maritime power that would later dominate the seas. But it was already beginning to stand out as a strategic refuge. For centuries, this small piece of land offered security to those seeking to escape wars and instability. The population grew slowly but steadily, and the place was integrated into the development of the future Republic of Venice. However, this relative tranquility began to disappear in the 9th century when political and territorial rivalries threatened the security of the lagoon. In the 14th century, things changed for good. During the battles between Venice and Genoa, the island became a strategic point and was even occupied by Genoese forces in 1379. However, the powerful Venetian fleet regained control shortly afterwards. This conflict, however, left its scars. From a safe haven, the place came to be seen as a military outpost, losing its former function for the locals. From then on, the population dwindled. Other larger, more developed islands became the priority, and this little piece of the lagoon was gradually forgotten. The worst chapters were yet to come. Number 3. First wave of the Black Plague. When the first wave of the Black Death hit Europe at the end of the 14th century, around 34 million people lost their lives in one of the darkest periods in history. Italy, with its intense commercial life, was hit hard, and Venice, with its open sewers, constant humidity, and busy streets, became a breeding ground for the epidemic. The city, once a symbol of wealth and prosperity, quickly became a veritable hell on earth. Piled-up corpses became part of the daily landscape, creating a macabre scene. Desperate, the authorities and clergy sought a solution. It was then that Poveglia, far from the urban center, was designated as a morgue and quarantine station. The island, which had previously been a refuge, became the final destination for the infected. Thousands of people were taken there, many still alive but doomed by the disease. The infected were isolated and left to die away from society, while bodies piled up in mass graves. And although it was already seen as a place of suffering, the worst was yet to come. Number 4. Second wave of the Black Plague. Centuries after the first wave of the Black Death, Europe once again faced new outbreaks of this seemingly never-ending disease. This time, Poveglia wasn't just a makeshift place to deal with the consequences. It was officially transformed into a quarantine station, the famous Lazaretto, where travelers suspected of being ill were sent before they had any contact with the continent. It was in 1776 that the tragedy reached another level. 2 ships with infected crew members were sent to the island. The idea seemed simple: park the ships there and keep everyone isolated. But there was no rescue plan or adequate care. The result? Chaos. The new residents of the ships began to get sick from each other until, before long, no one was healthy anymore. And to make matters worse, there were the doctors who looked after the sick and the bodies. They wore those horrible masks with a pointed beak that looked more like a horror costume. In fact, the beak was filled with aromatic herbs because they believed it filtered out the contaminated air. Those clothes were the personal protective equipment of the time, but they scared more than they protected. Even today, just seeing a picture of these masks makes you shiver. The problem was that nobody knew how the disease was actually transmitted. They thought it was spread directly between people, but the villain was actually contaminated fleas coming from rodents. And with the sanitary conditions of the time, there was no escape. With no structure and no way out, that episode was another dark chapter in the island's history. Number 5. Plague Island. Few people left Poveglia, and those who managed to escape carried with them the same fate: the plague. It was not a place of healing, but of abandonment. Quarantines, ineffective at treating the disease, were the only measure the desperate authorities could adopt to try to minimize the damage. In the first few weeks that infected people were sent to the island, completely without structure, it is estimated that 16,000 people died. The situation was so chaotic that Poveglia soon became a mass grave. Corpses piled up in the streets of Venice were taken on barges and dumped on the island, often alongside the living. It was a mixture of desperation and negligence. The cruel thing was that not everyone who was sent was actually contaminated. Without any clear criteria, the authorities simply collected people who appeared to be ill and sent them to isolation, without bothering to confirm whether they were really victims of the plague. Over time, even burying the dead became impossible. When there was no longer any way of dealing with the quantity of corpses, the solution was to burn them. Over the course of 40 years, around 160,000 people died on the island, leaving such an intense trail that, according to scientists, more than half of Poveglia's soil is made up of human ashes. But if you think this is the end of the horror story, you're far from it. Number 6. The Island of Madness. In 1922, after being abandoned for more than a century, Poveglia was given a new function, but nothing that would bring relief to its history of horrors. The island was turned into a psychiatric hospital, especially for the elderly. The government tried to reuse the old buildings left over from the plague, but what was bad became even worse. The poor facilities and lack of resources turned the place into a real nightmare. Over time, patients began arriving in their thousands, and soon the situation got out of hand. What was supposed to be a treatment center became a stage for abuse and macabre experiments, as was the case in many psychiatric hospitals of the time. But what really marked Poveglia out was the hospital director, who decided to turn the patients into guinea pigs to test revolutionary methods. Among them were brutal practices, such as lobotomies and trepanations, those in which the skull was pierced with chisels, hammers, and even hand drills. The result? Extreme suffering, deaths, or an irreversible worsening of the patient's health. It wasn't a cure, it was carnage. It is said that the director did not escape the consequences of his actions. After years of conducting these procedures, he began to report visions, the spirits of those who died at his hands, and of the souls abandoned on the island during the plague haunted him day and night. The pressure was so great that, according to a nurse, he climbed to the top of the bell tower and threw himself down. But the end wasn't quick. As he lay dying on the ground, covered in blood, a mist appeared and strangled him to death. Number 7. Sold Island. After the doctor at the psychiatric hospital took his own life by jumping from the bell tower, the hospital was closed, and Poveglia became even more abandoned. Time passed, but the island could not escape its dark reputation. In the 1960s, the Italian government decided to sell it. The new owner, excited by the idea of living on this isolated piece of land, tried to move there with his family. The attempt was short-lived. They were plagued by events which, according to reports, left no doubt that they were not alone. Constant hauntings took away any chance of peace, and the dream of living on the island soon turned into a nightmare. After this episode, another case further amplified the terrifying reputation of the place. A wealthy family bought the island, had a house built, and planned to spend an extended vacation there. However, they didn't last a single night. The owner compared the experience to the infamous case of Amityville, where paranormal events turned an ordinary home into one of the most haunted places in the world. As in Amityville, no one knows exactly what happened, but what little has been revealed is frightening. One of the family's daughters was attacked so brutally that she ended up with a deep cut on her face, requiring 14 stitches. After the incident, the family left the island, never to return, and the mystery surrounding the place became even greater. Mediums and paranormal investigators who visited the place described an unbearably heavy atmosphere. They reported feeling presences, hearing distant whispers and screams, like echoes of a past that never rested. Some claimed to see human-shaped shadows crossing their paths, while others felt an icy breath on their nape. Poveglia, according to these reports, seems to be one of the few places where the line between the world of the living and the afterlife is dangerously thin. Number 8. Hauntings. The island has become inaccessible, with entry permitted only to researchers or authorities, and any recording on site requires government approval. These restrictions have only served to reinforce the place's reputation as one of the most haunted in the world. In 2009, the Ghost Adventures program landed there, but things began to go wrong even before the investigation. The team's boat was stranded for 24 hours, as if the place was refusing a visit. On the island, unexplained noises, wandering shadows, and equipment breaking on its own were recorded. The producers reported feeling an oppressive energy and even witnessed what appeared to be human figures wandering around, as if the former psychiatric patients had never left. For them, it was like being at the epicenter of all evil. But the scariest story happened in 2017. 5 young men from Colorado, full of courage or recklessness, decided to spend a night exploring the place. Armed with flashlights and improvised equipment, they asked a boatman to pick them up the next morning. Little did they know that they wouldn't last until dawn. Shortly after midnight, the screams began. A sailboat passing nearby heard the desperation. "Ghosts! Ghosts!" When the firemen arrived to rescue them, they found the young people in shock, without their equipment, telling them that they had heard voices and terrible noises in the darkness. But what made them flee was a clear, threatening voice, which ordered, "Get out of here now and never come back." Reports of screams, shadows crossing the paths, and whispers in the ear are common among the few who have dared to explore the place. Mediums who have visited the place have spoken of a constant feeling of being watched, and an energy so heavy that it seemed impossible to breathe. Some claim to hear moans and cries for help coming from the abandoned hospital. While some believe it's all just exaggerated stories, there are those who swear that this piece of land holds something much darker than we can imagine. Number 9. Revitalization plans. In 2014, the Italian government decided to try something different: auctioning off the island. The idea was simple, at least in theory. Whoever bought it would have 99 years to restore the buildings and turn the place into a tourist attraction, but the property would still belong to the state. It is said that an Italian businessman bought the place for around £400,000, but nothing has happened since. And it's not hard to understand why. Restoring everything there would cost more than 50 million Rs, not to mention the reputation of the place. After all, turning one of the most haunted places in the world into a tourist destination isn't exactly simple. 4 years later, in 2018, an organization came up with a different proposal: to open up the island to any Italian citizen who wanted to explore it and learn about its history. Sounds like a good idea, right? Well, so far nothing has come of it, perhaps because many still see that piece of land as something that should remain in the past. Today, access remains restricted, and any attempt to visit requires official authorization. But if you're willing to pay around €200, some say it's possible to convince a brave boatman to take you there. The question is, would you dare to set foot in a place where every corner seems to scream stories of suffering and fear? And so ends our journey through the dark island of Poveglia and all the mysteries that surround it. What was the most memorable moment for you? Let us know in the comments. We want to know what you think. If you like exploring creepy stories full of mysteries and unusual settings in our Bello Mundo, keep following us. To those of you who have watched this far, thank you very much, and see you on your next adventure.